What if the world we know today is only the second version of humanity's story? Across continents and millennia, from the banks of the Tigris to the peaks of the Andes, cultures speak with a single, haunting voice. Once, the earth drowned. Oceans swallowed cities, rivers rose like armies, and the sky itself opened its gates. A great flood came, sparing only a few, washing away the rest. Why would Mesopotamian scribes, Hebrew prophets, Greek philosophers, and Mayan priests, all separated by oceans of land and centuries of time, tell the same tale? Were they remembering a real disaster, passed down in trembling whispers? Or was the flood a mirror of something deeper, etched into the human soul, the fear that nature can, at any moment, sweep us all away? Before the waters rose, there was a world of kings and shepherds, of thriving ports and sacred temples. But in every culture, that world faced an end, a line drawn by water. To step across it meant survival. To fall beneath it meant oblivion. This is not one myth, but a chorus of them. And together, they echo a truth humanity has never forgotten. The story begins in the silence before catastrophe, a world alive but unaware of the storm on the horizon. In ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, rivers were lifelines and killers both. Cities like Uruk and Ur rested on fertile plains, their temples reaching to the skies as if defying the chaos of nature. But the rivers had moods. They rose suddenly, in violent surges, drowning fields and sweeping away clay homes. To live there was to gamble with water itself. Out of this fragile balance was born the tale of a flood so vast, it erased everything. Far to the west, Greek philosophers preserved whispers of Atlantis, a land of power and splendor, suddenly swallowed by the sea. It was more than a parable of hubris. It was a warning: civilization can vanish in a single night. Travel further east, and in India's Rigveda we meet Manu, the first man, warned by a sacred fish of an approaching deluge. In the Himalayas, waters surged down valleys like liquid walls, and people spoke of mountains themselves trembling under the flood's assault. And across the ocean, among the Maya, the Aztec, and the Inca, the same story took form. A world destroyed by water, humanity reset, survivors carrying memory like fire through the darkness. The pattern is uncanny. It is as if scattered peoples, isolated by geography, carried fragments of the same nightmare. Each wrapped it in their own gods, their own symbols, but the outline never changed. A flood comes. Humanity ends. A few endure. What was the source of this chorus? Was it memory of real cataclysms, glacial floods tearing across Ice Age landscapes, seas rising as the earth warmed, tsunamis devouring coasts? Or was it myth born from the universal human experience of fear, of rivers and rains that could destroy without warning? For the ancients, the flood was more than history or warning. It was destiny. To them, water was not only destruction, it was rebirth. Just as the Nile's yearly flood renewed the soil, so too could the great deluge cleanse humanity, sweep away corruption, and give rise to a purified world. In Mesopotamia, the story told of an Epishtim, chosen by the gods to survive while all others perished. In the Hebrew tradition, Noah became that figure. In India, Manu filled the same role. In Greece, it was Deucalion and Pyrrha, hurling stones over their shoulders to repopulate the earth. The names shift, but the story remains, chosen survivors carrying forward the spark of civilization. To hear these stories is to glimpse a human obsession, the thin line between survival and extinction. The flood myth was never about water alone, it was about the fragility of order, the knowledge that beneath our feet lies chaos, waiting. Imagine a family gathered around a fire on some forgotten plain, a storyteller's voice crackling against the night. Children lean in as he warns of the flood that once consumed their ancestors, reminding them, we are here only because someone survived. In those moments, myth became memory, memory became warning, and warning became identity. Before the waters rose, there was always a choice: to ignore the signs, or to prepare for the storm. Those who listened became the ancestors of all who followed. Those who did not were swept away. The flood myths begin not with drowning, but with silence. A silence heavy with tension. A silence before the storm. And into that silence steps our first witness, carved in clay 4,000 years ago, the Epic of. The sun blazed over the mud brick walls of Uruk, a city that rose like a jewel from the Mesopotamian plain. Its cigarettes pierced the sky, its markets throbbed with life, and its rulers claimed divine favor. Here, civilization itself took root, writing etched on clay tablets, law and kingship bound together, gods hovering over every harvest and flood. And yet, beneath the grandeur of Uruk lay fear. For the rivers that fed its fields could also devour them. Out of this fragile existence emerged a story that would become the oldest flood tale ever told. The Epic of Gilgamesh, inscribed in cuneiform on baked clay more than 4,000 years ago, was not only the saga of a restless king. It was also humanity's first surviving memory of the waters. In its heart lies the figure of Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, who heard the warning of the gods before the deluge came. The story tells us, the gods had grown weary of humanity's clamor, the endless noise of mortals filling the world. Their patience thinned, and their solution was annihilation. They would bring a flood to sweep humanity away. Yet one god, yea, whispered to Utnapishtim in secret, build a boat, vast and sealed, bring aboard your family, craftsmen, and the seed of every creature. Survival would come only to the prepared. Imagine this scene, the desert air hot against Utnapishtim's skin as he labored, hammering timbers together, his neighbors mocking him for building a ship on dry ground. The ark rose like a mountain, while the world around him continued in careless laughter. Then came the moment the skies turned black. Thunder rolled like divine anger, and the rivers burst their banks. Walls of water crashed through villages. Clay houses dissolved. The plains became ocean. Humanity cried out, but no cry could reach the gods. For 6 days and 7 nights, the storm raged. On the 7th day, silence. Utnapishtim opened the hatch. All he saw was endless water. His ark drifted to the peak of Mount Nasr, where it came to rest. Like Noah would later do, Utnapishtim released a dove, then a swallow, then finally a raven. The raven did not return. The waters had begun to fall. The survivors disembarked, offering sacrifice to the gods. And the gods, seeing the smoke rise, regretted their fury. They granted Utnapishtim and his wife immortality, a reward for preserving life itself. Thus, the tale within Gilgamesh became more than myth, it was a memory of survival etched into the DNA of Mesopotamian culture. But the flood in Gilgamesh is not only a tale of destruction. It is also about human longing. Gilgamesh, the mighty king of Uruk, sought Utnapishtim not merely to hear the story, but to find the secret of eternal life. In this, the flood becomes a boundary, not just between eras, but between mortal and immortal, between the fragile span of human existence and the endless horizon of the gods. The deluge was a reminder, humanity is temporary, but memory endures. The clay tablets that carry this story are themselves survivors. Buried in the ruins of Nineveh, they lay for millennia until modern archaeologists brushed the dust away. When they were read, the world was stunned. The story of Utnapishtim so closely mirrored the biblical tale of Noah that scholars could not ignore the connection. Two traditions, separated by centuries, echoing the same catastrophe. What does this mean? Did one tradition borrow from the other? Or were they both echoes of something far older, a real event that scarred the memory of humankind? In Mesopotamia, the land itself seems to answer. Archaeological layers reveal sudden deposits of river clay, signs of massive flooding around 2900 BCE. Entire settlements were buried in silt. People would have seen their world erased in an instant. For them, the flood was not a myth but a lived terror, transformed into story so it would never be forgotten. And yet, the genius of the Gilgamesh epic is not only in its preservation of disaster, but in its weaving of that disaster into the universal human struggle, the search for meaning in the face of mortality. The flood was more than water. It was the threshold between life and death, between despair and hope. Picture Gilgamesh, wearied from his journey, sitting before Utnapishtim as the immortal tells his tale. The king listens not as a conqueror, but as a man terrified of death. Utnapishtim's story is a gift, but also a warning: immortality is not for mortals. The flood may have preserved life, but it also sealed the truth: humans are meant to endure not forever, but in memory, in legacy, in the words etched into clay. And so Uruk, the city of walls, carried forward the oldest known flood story. Its echo would ripple outward, crossing centuries and cultures. The tale of Utnapishtim would become the tale of Noah, and through Noah, the story would reach every corner of the Abrahamic world. But before it crossed into scripture, it was already alive in Mesopotamia, told by priests in dim-lit temples, whispered by merchants in the marketplaces, chiseled by scribes who knew that stories outlast empires. From the banks of the Euphrates, the flood myth begins its journey westward. Next, it will pass into the world of prophets and patriarchs, where a righteous man named Noah will hear a divine command: build an ark and prepare for the end. The land of Canaan stretched beneath a restless sky. Hills rolled in shades of ochre and green, while ancient villages clung to the soil, their lives bound to the rhythm of rain and drought. Here, among herders and farmers, a story took form, one that would pass into scripture, shaping the imagination of half the world. It was the tale of Noah, a man called to stand against the drowning of creation. In the book of Genesis, the flood is not the act of capricious gods quarreling, as in Mesopotamia. It is a decision of one God, an act of judgment. Humanity had filled the earth with violence, corruption spreading like a shadow. The divine verdict was clear: the world would be undone, washed clean by waters unrestrained. Yet amid the ruin, one man found favor: Noah, a quiet figure of obedience. The voice came: build an ark. Not a fisherman's vessel, but a floating fortress of survival, vast as the length of a modern stadium, sealed with pitch inside and out. Into its wooden belly he would bring his family, and pairs of every living creature, the seed of creation itself. Imagine the enormity of the task. Timber dragged across dry ground, beams lifted into place, a colossal ship rising far from any sea. Neighbors must have stared in ridicule, scoffing at the old man building a ship against invisible rains. But the sky was already shifting. Dark clouds gathered at the edges of the horizon, heavy with unspoken menace. Then it came. The fountains of the deep burst forth, and the heavens opened. Rain fell not as drops, but as sheets, torrents pounding earth into mud. Rivers overflowed their banks, valleys became oceans, and mountains vanished beneath churning waves. Humanity's cries were drowned by the roar of the waters. Only the ark remained, adrift upon a world without landmarks, its timbers groaning under the weight of destiny. Inside, the air was thick with the musk of animals, the shuffle of hooves, the beating of wings. Noah's family huddled in the flickering glow of oil lamps, listening to the endless drum of rain above. Days blurred into nights, time itself swallowed by water. 40 days and nights the deluge raged, until at last the storm quieted. Yet even then, the world lay submerged for months. At last, Noah opened a window. He released a raven, then a dove. The dove returned, its wings empty. 7 days later, he sent it again, and it came back with an olive leaf, a symbol so powerful it still carries meaning today. The waters were receding. When the ark settled upon the mountains of Ararat, the door was opened, and the survivors stepped into silence. A silence of rebirth. The covenant followed. Noah built an altar, offering sacrifice. And in response, God set a bow in the sky, the rainbow, shimmering against the mist. It was not merely a promise that the waters would never again cover the earth. It was a contract between Creator and creation, binding humanity and heaven in a fragile peace. The story of Noah spread far beyond its Hebrew roots. In Jewish tradition, Noah was the righteous man who preserved humanity. In Christianity, the ark became a symbol of salvation, a vessel of faith carrying believers through the storm of sin. In Islam, Noah is honored as a prophet, his struggle told in the Quran with the same dramatic urgency: warnings ignored, a people lost, and a faithful servant preserved. But Noah's story is more than scripture. It is memory wrapped in theology, history transformed into revelation. Scholars see in it the imprint of Mesopotamia, where floods were constant threats. Others link it to real disasters, the Black Sea's dramatic expansion around 5600 BCE, when rising seas swallowed entire settlements, or the colossal floods unleashed by melting Ice Age glaciers. Whatever its root, the narrative carried something universal: humanity's fear of destruction and its longing for a second chance. Consider how the Noahic flood differs from Gilgamesh's tale. In Mesopotamia, the gods destroyed humanity because they were annoyed by its noise. In Genesis, the flood comes not from irritation but from morality, human corruption reaching a point beyond repair. The waters are judgment, but also mercy, a chance to start anew. It is this framing that gave Noah's story its enduring power. For ancient listeners, the flood was not just an event. It was a mirror. Would they live as those who ignored the warnings, swept away in their arrogance? Or would they be like Noah, who prepared in faith even when mocked? The ark itself became a symbol across ages. For some, it represented the church, a vessel carrying the faithful across the storms of the world. For others, it symbolized humanity's fragile relationship with nature, a reminder that survival demands foresight and obedience to forces larger than ourselves. And still, in quiet moments, the image lingers, a lone ship drifting over endless waters, carrying the last breath of life on earth. Few stories have etched themselves so deeply into the imagination of mankind. From the mountains of Ararat, the flood story would ripple outward, echoed in cultures far and wide. Yet the legend of a drowned world was not confined to prophets and patriarchs. In Greece, philosophers would whisper of a mighty island empire swallowed by the sea, a tale not of survival, but of loss. Next, we journey west, where Plato's voice preserves one of history's most enduring mysteries, the story of Atlantis. The Aegean waves shimmered under the Mediterranean sun, their surface calm, yet their depths hiding secrets. It was here, in the heart of Greek philosophy, that another flood story was preserved, not in clay tablets or sacred scripture, but in the dialogues of Plato. A tale of a mighty empire swallowed whole by the sea, Atlantis. The story came to us through two works, Timaeus and Critias. Written in the 4th century BCE, they recount an older legend said to have been passed from Egyptian priests to the Greek statesman Solon. According to this chain of memory, Atlantis was no mere city, it was an island kingdom beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. Its kings ruled with wealth, technology, and power unmatched. Its palaces gleamed with orichalcum, its harbors teemed with fleets, and its fields yielded plenty. But abundance bred arrogance. The Atlanteans, once noble, turned greedy, lusting after conquest. Their armies reached into the Mediterranean, threatening even Athens. And so, the gods judged them. In a single day and night of misfortune, the earth shook, the seas rose, and Atlantis vanished beneath the waves, leaving only memory. Plato presented the story as both history and parable. Was it a real account of a lost civilization? Or was it allegory, a mirror of hubris, a warning that great powers fall when they forget justice? To this day, the question haunts scholars, divers, and dreamers alike. Picture the drama, an island empire flourishing in splendor, only to collapse in fury. Imagine the final moments, palaces crumbling as earthquakes tore through marble columns, ships tossed like leaves as tsunamis devoured harbors, a people screaming into saltwater darkness. Whether myth or truth, the image is unforgettable. Some see Atlantis not as fiction, but as distorted memory. Could Plato have been echoing real events from humanity's distant past? Archaeologists point to disasters etched into the Mediterranean's history. The eruption of Thera, Santorini, around 1600 BCE unleashed a volcanic fury so vast it reshaped the Aegean, sending tsunamis crashing onto Crete, shattering the Minoan civilization. To survivors, it must have felt like the gods themselves had drowned the world. Could this have been the seed of Atlantis? Others look further afield, to the Atlantic, the Caribbean, even Antarctica, seeking ruins beneath the sea. Each generation seems unable to let Atlantis rest. Explorers scan the ocean floor, writers conjure utopias, filmmakers resurrect the island in blazing spectacle. Atlantis has become more than a myth. It is humanity's lost mirror, reflecting both our dreams of perfection and our fear of sudden annihilation. And yet, in Plato's hands, Atlantis was not only about destruction. It was about Athens. By setting his city as the heroic foil to Atlantis' arrogance, he celebrated the virtues of balance, order, and restraint. The fall of Atlantis was not random, it was a divine caution. Civilizations that forget humility are doomed to sink beneath their own pride. But why did this story endure? Why did it lodge so deeply in the Western imagination when countless other Greek myths faded? Perhaps because Atlantis is unfinished. Unlike the flood of Noah, which ends in covenant, or the flood of Utnapishtim, which ends in immortality, Atlantis ends in silence. No survivors step ashore. No olive branch signals hope. Only the sea remains. That silence is its power. Atlantis lingers because it feels possible. Somewhere, perhaps, beneath uncharted waters, lie stones that once formed avenues, temples, and harbors. The lost world calls to us, not only as tragedy, but as promise. To find Atlantis would be to uncover proof that myths are memories, that stories whispered across millennia conceal truths waiting to be unearthed. But Atlantis was not alone. From the Greek islands to the shores of Egypt and the valleys of India, flood stories multiplied, each carrying its own blend of history and allegory. Some speak of rivers that swallowed empires, others of seas that erased kingdoms. Together they form a pattern too vast to dismiss. The Great Flood is never just water. It is judgment, rebirth, and the fragile line between memory and myth. And as the story flows eastward, we find echoes of Atlantis in lands older still, echoes inscribed in the hymns of India, where a sacred fish warns of a flood that will wash away the world. Along the banks of the Nile, life was born from the rhythm of water. Each year, the river swelled, spilling its black silt across the floodplain, turning desert into garden. To the Egyptians, the flood was not destruction, it was blessing, the breath of the god Hapi, giver of fertility. Yet even here, where the Nile's rise was celebrated, stories whispered of waters that could one day rise too far, erasing order and plunging the land into chaos. For a people who worship balance, Ma'at, the fear of a flood beyond measure was not fantasy, but a shadow always lurking. Travel eastward, into the vastness of India, and the flood becomes prophecy. In the Rig Veda, one of the oldest surviving texts of humanity, we meet Manu, the ancestor of mankind. While washing his hands in the river, Manu caught a tiny fish. To his surprise, the fish spoke, warning him of a coming deluge that would sweep away all living things. "Care for me," the fish urged, "and I will save you." Manu placed it in a jar, then in a pond, then in a river, and finally in the ocean, as it grew larger with each vessel. When the waters came, the fish revealed itself as Vishnu, the preserver. Guided by a divine rope tied to the fish's horn, Manu's boat rode the storm until the waters fell, and he alone remained to begin humanity anew. Here, as in Noah's tale, survival comes through obedience to warning. But in India, the flood is not punishment, it is cosmic cycle. Destruction and creation follow one another like the tides, each necessary, each eternal. From the deserts of Egypt to the hymns of India, the flood motif changes its colors but not its outline. In both, humanity is fragile, life hangs on divine favor, and the waters are always close. Further east still, in China, the flood myth takes on a heroic form. The ancient texts speak of the Great Yu, a man who tamed the endless waters that once covered the land. Unlike Noah or Manu, Yu did not escape the flood. He fought it, carving channels with his hands, guiding rivers back to their courses. His struggle gave China its varied landscape. Dynasties would later claim descent from him, and his victory over the deluge became a foundation of kingship itself. The flood was not only a warning, it was a test of legitimacy, proof that only rulers who control chaos could govern the Middle Kingdom. In all these lands, the story is the same, yet different. In Egypt, flood was the Nile's rhythm. In India, a cosmic reset. In China, a battle between human will and nature's fury. But everywhere, water was destiny. Why do these stories echo across continents? Perhaps because floods were among the first disasters humanity ever knew. For early farmers, a sudden rise in rivers meant hunger, exile, or death. For coastal dwellers, tsunamis arrived like liquid mountains, erasing generations in moments. The memory of water was carved into human survival, and so it flowed into their myths. But myth was never just about memory. It was meaning. These floods were not accidents, they were messages. Warnings of divine displeasure, reminders of humanity's limits, or promises of renewal. To live near rivers and seas was to live under judgment. And so, whether in Egypt, India, or China, humanity learned to tell itself the same story: water will come, chaos will rise, but survival is possible. Through favor, obedience, or courage, life can begin again. From the fertile banks of the Nile to the snow-fed rivers of the Himalayas, the flood myth spread like the waters themselves. Yet the echoes did not stop there. Across mountains, deserts, and oceans, they reached the distant Americas, where peoples with no contact with Mesopotamia or Greece also remembered the world drowning. And it is there, in the myths of the Maya, the Aztec, and the Inca, that we turn next. High in the Andes, where clouds wrap around snow-capped peaks, the Quechua people tell of a flood that once swallowed the world. In their story, only 2 humans survived, sheltering inside a box that floated upon the waters until it came to rest on a mountain peak. From them, the Inca traced their line, a people born from catastrophe and renewal. Travel north, into the lands of the Maya, and the story takes a different shape. In the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of creation, the gods grew dissatisfied with their early attempts at making humanity. One version of mankind, made of wood, had no soul, no gratitude. And so, the gods unleashed a flood. The wooden people were scattered, drowned, and destroyed, their remnants transformed into monkeys, forever mocking what they had once been. For the Maya, the flood was not simply about survival, it was about the failure to live rightly before the gods. Among the Aztecs, the flood story pulses with prophecy. They told of a world that had ended 4 times already, each destruction by fire, wind, jaguars, or water. The age of the flood, they believed, was one of those cycles: the sun fell, the skies opened, and the earth drowned. Only a man and a woman survived by hollowing out a great cypress tree, hiding within until the waters receded. Their tale, like Noah's or Manu's, spoke of fragile survival amid divine wrath. Further north, among the Hopi of the American Southwest, the story is one of escape. The people, warned by the deity Spider-Woman of a coming flood, climbed into hollow reeds that grew into the sky. From these living arcs, they emerged into a new world after the waters retreated. For the Hopi, the flood was both destruction and passage, an ending of one world and the birth of another. And in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, the Haida, Tlingit, and others remembered mountains swallowed by the sea, canoes tethered to peaks as the waters rose. Entire landscapes were said to vanish beneath the tide, stories that resonate uncannily with geological memory. Scientists today note that these coasts bear scars of massive tsunamis, triggered by earthquakes along the Cascadia Fault. The people remembered in story what stone remembered in silence. What strikes us across these American myths is their isolation. Separated by oceans from the civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, or India, they nonetheless preserve the same pattern: a flood comes, humanity is nearly lost, a remnant survives. Whether it was a box in the Andes, a tree in the Aztec plains, or reeds among the Hopi, the vessel of survival always appears. Why? Perhaps because the Americas, too, bore witness to floods of unimaginable scale. At the end of the Ice Age, glacial lakes burst across North America, unleashing torrents that carved canyons and drowned valleys. Along the Pacific, mega tsunamis left shorelines devastated. These were not small, local disasters. To those who survived, they must have felt like the very end of the world. And yet, in every story, survival remains the heartbeat. The people never vanish completely. Someone, somewhere, endures, carrying memory into the next age. The flood, though terrifying, becomes a threshold. It destroys, but it also transforms. From the Andes to the deserts, from the forests to the plains, the Americas carried the same haunting memory as Sumer, as Egypt, as India. Humanity scattered across the world still spoke in one voice. The waters rose, the world drowned, and yet, we remain. But the flood stories are not confined to the great river valleys or the coasts. Even isolated mountain peoples and island cultures remember them. In the next chapter, we climb into the highlands and cross into remote archipelagos, where echoes of the deluge still linger among peaks and waves. High above the lowlands, where the air thins and clouds coil around jagged peaks, flood myths take on a sharper edge. For mountain peoples, the waters were not distant rivers or seas, they were walls of death that climbed valleys and swallowed villages whole. To live in the highlands was to look down upon plains once drowned, to remember ancestors clinging to cliffs as the world below vanished. In the Himalayas, legends linger of lakes bursting their bounds, sweeping valleys clean of life. Among Tibetan traditions, the first people were said to have survived a flood by seeking refuge in the mountains, guided by protective spirits who shielded them until the waters fell. Survival here was not through arks or vessels, but through the endurance of altitude itself, mountains as sanctuaries against the wrath of nature. Across the seas, and island peoples echo the same story. In Polynesia, tales tell of gods who unleashed floods upon those who disobeyed, submerging entire islands beneath the Pacific. The waters, vast and merciless, were both punishment and passage. Some stories recall chiefs who lashed their canoes to mountaintops, watching their homes sink beneath the waves. Others speak of trickster deities who saved the faithful by guiding them to new islands beyond the horizon. On the islands of the Philippines, a deluge story survives of two siblings, warned by a bird of a coming flood. They hid in a bamboo stalk, floating as the waters raged, until the seas calmed and they emerged to repopulate the land. In Japan, too, myths whisper of floods unleashed by quarrelsome gods, reshaping coastlines and erasing villages. What unites these tales is the element of isolation. For islanders, the ocean is both cradle and grave. It feeds them with fish, carries their canoes to new worlds, but also threatens to devour everything with one violent surge. The flood myth here feels almost inevitable, a reflection of daily life lived at the mercy of tides and storms. Geology supports their fears. Across the Pacific, entire archipelagos bear scars of sudden inundations. Ancient coral reefs reveal rapid sea level rises. Volcanic eruptions, like Krakatoa in 1883, hurled tsunamis across the seas, killing tens of thousands. Survivors, watching waves erase villages, must have felt they were witnessing the end of the world. Their descendants preserve those memories not in chronicles, but in chants and oral traditions, sung to the rhythm of the ocean itself. And yet, within these flood myths of mountains and islands, one theme repeats: endurance. Humanity is never wholly erased. Whether clinging to bamboo, fastening canoes to peaks, or following a divine guide across the seas, a fragment survives. In every culture, no matter how remote, the flood becomes not just an ending but a beginning. It is this universality that unsettles us. How could peoples separated by oceans and millennia imagine the same disaster? Did they all draw from the well of real events, glacial floods, tsunamis, volcanic surges? Or does the flood live within us as a psychological truth, an instinctive metaphor for the fragility of life? From the mountain passes of Tibet to the drifting canoes of Polynesia, the echoes gather strength. They are no longer local stories. They are a global chorus, each voice harmonizing with the others, repeating the same refrain: the waters rose, the world drowned, and yet humanity endured. But if myth is memory, can science decode it? Can geology, archaeology, and climate history uncover the truth behind these flood stories? To answer, we must leave the realm of legend and step into the world of evidence, where ancient fears meet modern discovery. Beneath the poetry of legend lies the bedrock of the earth itself, and it too remembers. Where myth speaks in voices of gods and heroes, geology answers in layers of stone, in sediments laid down by ancient waters. The question is not whether floods have scarred humanity, but which of them could have inspired memories so vast they became timeless. Begin at the end of the Ice Age, around 12,000 years ago. The earth was warming, glaciers retreating, seas rising. In North America, walls of ice dammed colossal lakes, Lakes Missoula and Agassiz among them. When those ice walls broke, the release was apocalyptic. Torrents roared across the continent, carving canyons, shifting boulders the size of houses, reshaping the land in hours. For those who saw it, it must have seemed the world itself was dissolving. The Scablands of Washington state, scarred with deep channels, are monuments to such cataclysms. Across the Atlantic, another event may hold the key to the myths. Around 5600 BCE, the Mediterranean surged into the Black Sea. Rising global seas overwhelmed the Bosporus Strait, unleashing a torrent that expanded the Black Sea's shoreline for hundreds of miles. Villages were drowned overnight. If memory could pass through generations, perhaps this was the deluge that echoed in Mesopotamia and beyond. And then, there is the Younger Dryas, a sudden climatic event some 12,800 years ago. Temperatures plunged, ice sheets fractured, and some scientists argue massive floods swept across continents. Whether caused by glacial collapse, comet impact, or shifting oceans, the result would have been catastrophic for early peoples. To them, it may have felt as though the heavens themselves had declared war. Closer to the Mediterranean, the story of Atlantis may itself find geological parallels. The eruption of Thera, on the island of Santorini, around 1600 BCE, unleashed one of the most powerful volcanic events in recorded history. Ash blotted out skies, tsunamis crashed across the Aegean, and the once thriving Minoan civilization faltered in its wake. To survivors, it must have felt like a proud island kingdom had truly sunk beneath the sea. Plato's story, though wrapped in allegory, could well have been rooted in collective memory of this disaster. But the science does not merely explain myth, it sharpens its poignancy. For the peoples of river valleys, floods were seasonal, predictable. Yet every so often came a flood beyond all measure, one that drowned not just fields but entire ways of life. Archaeologists working in Mesopotamia have uncovered flood layers, thick deposits of river silt that abruptly cut through the remains of ancient settlements. Around 2900 BCE, one such flood swept through Shuruppak and other Sumerian cities. Though not global, for those who endured it, it was total, their entire world erased. Such events, retold for generations, could easily swell into cosmic legend. Modern science also points to tsunamis, those sudden walls of water that rise without warning. In 1700, a massive earthquake off the Pacific Northwest sent waves crashing into Japan, recorded in their chronicles as an orphan tsunami. But in ancient times, survivors had only stories. Imagine a coastal village watching the sea vanish, the shoreline retreating, only to return minutes later as a black wall taller than trees. Survivors of such cataclysms would tell their children not just a disaster, but a divine judgment. Yet science alone cannot strip these stories of their mythic power. For even if we can point to glaciers melting or tectonic plates shifting, the human memory of flood is never just geology. It is morality, fragility, survival. It is the sense that water is not merely element, but force, uncontrollable, divine, alive. And so, the dialogue continues. Archaeologists map drowned coastlines, climatologists model ancient storms, yet storytellers remind us, what matters is not just that floods happened, but how they were understood. Myths are not weather reports. They are the soul of survival, passed like heirlooms across millennia. The flood myths endure not because they are accurate records, but because they transform terror into meaning. They tell us that even when the world drowns, someone survives. That chaos, no matter how overwhelming, can be endured. Science, then, does not diminish the myths. It deepens them. For when we see the scars of ancient floods carved into rock, we realize, humanity was right to fear the waters. The deluge did come again and again. And each time, the survivors carried forward the story. Now, the myths turn inward. Having looked at the past through the eyes of geology, we must ask, what did the ancients themselves see in these floods? Not just events, but symbols. Not just disasters, but messages. In the next chapter, we step into the realm of meaning, where water becomes not only history, but prophecy. Across every culture, the flood is not just an event, it is a language. Water, in myth, does more than destroy, it cleanses, renews, transforms. Where science sees tides and rainfall, mythmakers saw the hand of the divine, erasing the sins of the past to prepare the soil for something new. In Mesopotamia, the flood was a punishment, but also a reset. Utnapishtim survives, yes, but his survival is not only physical. He becomes witness, custodian of divine memory. The deluge marks the threshold between ages, separating one cycle of humanity from the next. To the Sumerians, water was chaos, but chaos that could be harnessed. The Hebrew story of Noah deepened this symbolism. In Genesis, the flood is not just disaster, it is judgment. Humanity, corrupt and violent, is purged by 40 days of water. Yet the ark is more than a vessel, it is a seed, a capsule of life carrying forward every creature to a reborn earth. The rainbow that follows is not merely a meteorological arc, but a contract, a binding promise that destruction would never again be so absolute. The flood becomes prophecy, a warning about the cost of human corruption and the mercy of renewal. In Hindu cosmology, the symbolism stretches further. The god Vishnu, as Matsya, the fish, rescues Manu, the first man, from the cosmic flood. Here, the waters are not punishment but a stage in the eternal cycle. The flood represents Pralaya, the dissolution of the universe, after which creation itself begins anew. Unlike the one-time catastrophe of Noah, Hindu thought places the flood at the very heart of cosmic rhythm, death feeding life, endings birthing beginnings. Buddhist and Chinese traditions also entwine flood with transformation. In China, the myth of Yu the Great tells of a flood so immense it covered the mountains. But he does not escape it, he masters it, channeling waters into rivers and canals. His victory marks the dawn of ordered civilization, a myth that turns chaos into governance, destruction into law. Even in distant cultures, the flood carries this duality of doom and rebirth. In Native American stories, coyote, raven, or other trickster figures often save humanity from drowning, introducing not just survival but new wisdom. In Polynesia, the deluge punishes the arrogant yet gives survivors with new islands, new horizons to explore. Always, the waters take, but they also give. The psychological weight of these symbols runs deep. The flood represents erasure, of pride, of corruption, of hubris. Yet it also represents the possibility of starting over. For ancient peoples, to endure the flood was to earn the right to live in a new world. The survivors were not just lucky, they were chosen, tasked with carrying forward memory, tradition, law. But the prophecy of the flood is never truly past. Even today, the myth lingers as a warning. Climate change, rising seas, hurricanes, and tsunamis all summon echoes of the ancient terror. Images of cities drowned, coasts erased, fields turned to marsh remind us of stories once dismissed as legend. The flood myth is not only about what was, it is about what could be again. Humanity, it seems, cannot escape the feeling that the waters will rise once more. And so, the flood myth endures because it is both history and metaphor. It explains natural disasters, but also human nature, our capacity for corruption, our vulnerability before forces greater than ourselves, our hope for renewal after destruction. It is prophecy not in the sense of foretelling dates, but in revealing truths. Every civilization that grew complacent, that imagined itself invincible, carried within it the whisper of the flood, the world can drown, and with it, you. Yet, within this dread lies reassurance. The flood myth does not end in annihilation. Always, there is survival, whether in an ark, a canoe tied to a mountaintop, a bamboo stalk, or the hands of a guiding god. Always, there is renewal. The flood is terrifying precisely because it is not final. It washes away, but it also clears the ground for something greater. As we listen to these ancient prophecies, we hear echoes not only of doom but of resilience. Humanity has always lived at the mercy of water, but it has also always endured. And now, as the myths prepare to close, one final question lingers. What do these stories tell us about ourselves? Not as isolated civilizations, but as a species? In the final chapter, the waters fall silent, and we reflect on why the flood remains the one story that unites us all. The rains have long since passed, the rivers have calmed, and the oceans lie seemingly still. Yet beneath their surface, the flood myths continue to ripple through time. From clay tablets buried in Mesopotamian soil to the chants of Polynesian navigators, from the rainbow covenant of Noah to the lost island of Atlantis, the waters whisper the same refrain: we have been here before, and we will be here again. It is striking how deeply these stories have embedded themselves into human consciousness. They are not fragments of forgotten folklore, they are foundations. They surface in scripture, in epics, in oral traditions told by firelight, and in the ink of philosophers and poets. When a child hears of Noah, or of Utnapishtim, or of Manu, they are not only hearing of a flood, they are inheriting the memory of catastrophe, wrapped in hope. The endurance of these stories reveals a truth about humanity itself. Across ages, across continents, we have all wrestled with the same fear, that the world can vanish in a tide of water. But the myths remind us that within that fear is also renewal. The flood is humanity's most universal metaphor because it captures the fragile balance of life. Water is life, yet water is also death. It builds civilizations along fertile riverbanks, and it destroys them with one unrelenting surge. Perhaps that is why these myths feel as relevant today as they did thousands of years ago. In an age of rising seas, melting glaciers, and storms more violent than any in living memory, the ancient warnings echo louder. Cities gleam with towers of glass and steel, yet they remain vulnerable to the same elemental force that once swept away clay-wall villages. In every floodplain, in every coastline, humanity still stands where its ancestors once stood, at the mercy of the waters. But the flood myths are not only about fear. They are about survival. They are about the ark, the canoe, the bamboo stalk, the mountain peak. They remind us that the waters recede, that humanity rebuilds, that life persists. They tell us that every ending is also a beginning. The voices of these stories reach across cultures not as isolated echoes, but as a single chorus. The Mesopotamian scribe, the Hebrew prophet, the Indian sage, the Polynesian navigator, all told different versions of the same truth. And in their unity lies the deepest power of the flood myth. It is the one story that belongs to everyone. Even in silence, the waters still speak. They speak in the gullies carved by vanished floods, in the coral reefs that once were coastlines, in the drowned forests resting beneath the sea. They speak in the rhythm of waves that lap against the shore, whispering of the past, warning of the future. And so, the flood myth endures, not as a relic of superstition, but as a mirror. It reflects our fears, our fragility, our resilience. It tells us that no matter how high we build our walls, no matter how great our empires, the waters will always be there, patient and eternal. The flood is not just a story of yesterday. It is a story of today. It is a story of tomorrow. And as long as rivers run and oceans surge, the flood will remain the one myth that truly belongs to all of humanity.